There are stories they bury so deep, the land itself forgets. But sometimes, the dead remember. Have you ever felt the air shift, just before you uncover something that was never meant to be known? That quiet sense that something ancient and unspeakable is about to resurface? Good. Because what I'm about to share with you is not a legend. It's not some ghost story passed around a campfire. It is a documented historical account buried in the hills of eastern Kentucky, one that tore a quiet Baptist village apart and still has no scientific explanation. The year was 1834. The town was Pine Hollow, a remote mountain settlement so isolated that its existence barely made it onto maps. And into this town walked a man, Reverend Ezekiel Morrison, with 2 9-year-old twin daughters who were different. Rebecca and Rachel Morrison didn't just act strangely. They knew things, intimate, dangerous truths that no one had told them. And within 72 hours of their arrival, they would reveal so many buried secrets that the town's pastor, William Phillips, stopped preaching and started recording everything. This isn't just a case of child prodigies or religious hysteria. Psychologists have studied the entries in Pastor Phillips's journal. The twins knew the location of hidden items, predicted tragedies, exposed private sins, and described events that occurred years before they were born, with verifiable accuracy. Even today, not a single one of their revelations has been debunked. That's why this story has been quietly studied by religious scholars, neuroscientists, and historians for decades. And yet, you've likely never heard it. The Morrison twins weren't prophets. They weren't possessed. And if they were faking, then every person in Pine Hollow was part of a conspiracy so airtight, it's more terrifying than the truth. Because this story, it doesn't just ask, what did they know? It demands something deeper. How did they know? And who made sure you never heard about it? The journey that brought the Morrisons to Pine Hollow was already a descent into shadows. Reverend Ezekiel Morrison was not a man of comfort. He walked circuit routes through the Appalachians, preaching in backwoods churches most had forgotten. His reputation? Revival. Wherever he went, people seemed to change. Congregations reawakened, marriages mended, long-standing feuds resolved. But those who paid attention noticed the shift didn't begin with his sermons. It began with the twins. Rebecca and Rachel were born in isolation. Their mother, Sarah, died giving birth to them during a brutal winter storm. The nearest midwife never made it through the snow, and from that night onward, Ezekiel claimed, the girls were strange, not evil, not unkind, but burdened, as if the veil between worlds was thinner for them. Pine Hollow, population 204, was a settlement gripped by religious rigidity. A wooden chapel, no steeple, no bells, just the old Baptist hymns echoing through the hills. Outsiders were rare. So when the Morrisons arrived in the bitter dusk of November 15, 1834, the town took notice. Pastor Phillips, an educated man who had abandoned urban comfort for frontier conviction, wrote in his journal that Ezekiel looked hollowed by grief and time. His boots were cracked from years on the trail, his eyes sunken with something deeper than exhaustion. The girls, pale, quiet, holding each other's hands like they were born clinging to the same lifeline. The first night, as they sat at the pastor's dinner table, Rebecca asked a question that chilled the room. Did the roses on the east fence ever grow back after the blight? A simple question, until Mrs. Phillips dropped her spoon. The blight had killed her prized roses 3 summers earlier. a detail never spoken outside the town. Rebecca just smiled. I dreamed about them. They were sad. That sentence was right, 10, word for word, in Pastor Phillips's journal. It would be the first of dozens of moments that broke the minds of rational men. Because within 24 hours, these girls would begin pulling secrets from the hearts of Pine Hollow's most respected elders. Not guesses, not parlor tricks, but exact knowledge, known only to the guilty, the grieving, and the damned. And they weren't asking for attention. They weren't even asking for forgiveness. They were simply revealing. By the time morning broke over Pine Hollow, a storm had gathered, not of rain or wind, but of something deeper. An atmospheric shift, the kind that settles into your bones before your mind even notices. The church's windows rattled, but there was no breeze. The air was thick, like the valley itself was holding its breath. Pastor Phillips awoke early. It was his custom to pray alone before the day began. But this time, Ezekiel was already sitting by the cold fireplace. His Bible was open, but unread. His eyes were distant. They dreamt again, he said without looking up. But these dreams were different. Pastor Phillips asked what they saw. Ezekiel didn't answer directly. They dream about where we're going, always have. But this time, they said the ground is soaked in secrets. Then Rebecca walked into the room. She was barefoot, hair tangled from sleep, but her gaze was direct, awake, unsettlingly focused. She spoke plainly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. In your church, she said, under the third floorboard from the altar, something is hidden that shouldn't be. Phillips froze. That spot, beneath the pulpit, held a secret. A bottle of whiskey, hidden during a moment of weakness. He had wrapped it in an old blue cloth, a piece of his dead son's baby blanket. No one knew. He had told no one, not even his wife. Rachel appeared behind her sister. The bottle is brown, she said, wrapped in something soft, like a baby's blanket, blue, with tiny stars. Philip sat down. Hard. He couldn't speak. They weren't guessing. They weren't pretending. They knew. Ezekiel, watching him carefully, said nothing. There was no smugness, no apology, only the weathered look of a man who'd seen this too many times. It began when they were toddlers, he said. At first I thought it was coincidence, but by the time they could write, they were describing things no child should know. Phillips asked quietly, "Is this a gift?" Ezekiel hesitated. "I used to think so. Now I think it's something else, something older." He paused. Some people are born to carry truth, even when that truth burns everyone it touches. The wind picked up. The church loomed outside like a relic from another world. And the twins, they stood together now, silent, watching, like they already knew what would happen next. The Sunday sermon should have been forgettable, a typical call to repentance, framed in Ezekiel's passionate revivalist tone. But what happened after that service was anything but typical. As the final hymn faded, the congregation began to file out, silent, reflective. But the Morrison twins did not move. Rebecca stepped down from the front pew and walked straight toward Samuel Turner. Turner was a deacon, a man respected, feared even. Rebecca looked up at him with those unsettling eyes and said, "Mr. Turner, if you put the money back, it won't be stealing anymore. God still forgives, even if people don't." Turner's hands began to tremble. No one else knew. For 6 months, he'd been skimming from the collection plate, small amounts to cover his business losses in Louisville. No trail, no evidence, and yet, here was this child, exposing it in front of everyone. Before Turner could respond, Rachel turned to the back of the room and spoke to a woman sitting stiffly at the edge of the pews. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said softly, "your husband didn't die in that farming accident, did he?" The widow's breath caught. "You still have the letters, the ones he sent you from Missouri." Silence fell like a hammer. Martha Whitfield's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing, because she couldn't deny it. Not now. And then, as if some unseen signal passed between them, the twins began moving through the congregation, one quiet revelation at a time. To Dr. Hayes, they whispered about patients who died under his care, mistakes he never admitted. To the Miller family, they asked why their son never came outside, the one hidden in the attic because of his mind. To young Thomas Brett, they spoke of his secret meetings with Elizabeth Carter, a married woman, and he, a boy barely 19. Every word hit like a blow. These weren't accusations. They were facts. P. resented with the innocence of children discussing the weather. But make no mistake, they were tearing the town apart. People who had known each other for decades stared now with suspicion, fear, even hatred. Not because of the twins, but because of what their truths exposed. And then, Rebecca walked to the front of the church. She touched the cross above the altar. "This place is sacred," she said, "but it's been stained." The words she spoke next would shatter what was left of Pine Hollow's illusion of holiness. The Wittman family didn't die in a house fire. Did they, Pastor Phillips? They died here, in this room. And some of you know exactly why. The silence that followed could have split the rafters. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if time itself refused to continue until someone acknowledged what had just been said. Rebecca stood still, hand on the wooden cross carved by the church's founders, her small fingers tracing the edge like it held a memory only she could feel. Pastor Phillips gripped the pulpit so tightly the veins in his arms bulged. The Wittman tragedy had always been whispered about, but never questioned. A house fire, a tragic accident, the loss of an entire family. That was the story. That was the law in Pine Hollow. But now, this child, this outsider, this seer, had torn that law apart in front of the entire congregation. Elder Thomas Thompson, one of the church's founding elders, slowly rose from his pew. A man in his 70s, bones brittle with arthritis, eyes darkened by memory. "Child," he said, his voice careful, cracked with time. "You speak of things that happened before your birth, things you have no way of knowing. So how—" Rebecca turned to him and smiled. Not with malice, but something older, something sad. "Faith Wittman had a birthmark on her left shoulder," she said. Hope had one on her ankle, a small patch shaped like a crescent moon. They both had long braids. Faith carried a wooden doll with one eye missing. Hope wore a silver locket with a piece of their mother's hair. The air left the room like a dying breath. Pastor Phillips blinked. Slowly. Those were details never recorded, never spoken aloud. Details he'd only ever heard once, whispered in grief by Elder Thompson's wife 30 years ago. "How do you know this?" he asked, voice thin, cracking. Rachel stepped forward, We see them in dreams. They come to us when people try to forget. They come when truth has been buried too long. The elder sat down without a word, face pale, gaze empty. And then Rachel spoke again, softer this time. They weren't burned in a fire. They came here, to the church, for safety. But the people they feared were already inside. Now it was the congregation that recoiled. Gasps, murmurs, the clenching of fists. Old sins had awakened, not just gossip, guilt. You could see it on their faces, the older ones, those who remembered, those who had lied. The air was growing heavier now, thick with reckoning, and the children, no longer innocent in the eyes of this crowd, were leading them deeper into darkness. One truth at a time. Pastor Phillips felt the walls closing in. The timbered sanctuary he had once considered sacred now pulsed with invisible weight, like it had become a coffin of secrets, each one hammering against the wood from within. Rebecca's voice still echoed in his mind. They came for sanctuary, but the ones they feared were already inside. And she hadn't been speaking metaphorically. The Wittman twins, Hope and Faith, had died in this room, not in their home, not by accident, but here, in the house of God, a sanctuary that had become a tomb. He scanned the faces of the congregation, and what he saw wasn't denial, it was recognition. Elder Thompson clutched the edge of the pew as if it were the only thing keeping him from falling. His wife stared straight ahead, her lips trembling with unshed words. And then, one by one, the others began to speak. Mrs. Carter whispered about bloodstains that appeared on the sanctuary floorboards in 1820, stains that no amount of scrubbing had ever removed. Old Benjamin Foster mumbled of cries heard in the church at night, children's cries, dismissed as wind through the wood. Dr. Hayes, his pride long since broken, admitted that during a repair to the eastern wall 3 years earlier, they'd found something mixed with the foundation stone, small fragments that looked too much like bone. Phillips wanted to stop it all, to command silence, to re-establish control. But he knew it was far too late. This wasn't a sermon, it was an exorcism, and the demon wasn't in the twins. It was in the church itself. Then, Ezekiel finally spoke. He had been silent the whole time, watching his daughters dismantle this town with nothing but dreams and honesty. His voice was calm, resolute. "I've seen this before," he said, "in Virginia, in Carolina, in the Ozarks. My daughters don't see the future. They see what is, what was buried. They are not prophets. They are mirrors." Pastor Phillips turned to him, eyes wide. "But how?" he demanded. "What kind of gift is this?" Ezekiel shook his head. "Gift? You call this a gift? These girls walk through the shadows of men's sins. They pay for the truth with pieces of their own peace." Rebecca looked up at him then, her face pale but composed. "We don't want to see," she whispered. "We never want to see." Rachel echoed, "But they won't stop until someone listens." That was the moment Pastor Phillips realized. This wasn't a haunting. It was a reckoning. And it had just begun. That night, no one in Pine Hollow slept. Oil lamps burned in windows long after midnight. Doors stayed bolted. Eyes watched the church like it might breathe. Pastor Phillips sat alone at his desk, the loose journal of Pastor Hayes spread before him, each water-damaged page cutting deeper than any sermon he had ever preached. "The Lord forgive us for what was done." He couldn't read that line without shaking. But worse than the words was the silence of those still alive. None had denied what Rebecca had said. Not one. The elder families, the Turners, the Whitfields, the Thompsons, they wore guilt like a second skin. They knew. Maybe not the whole truth, but enough. And they had stayed quiet. For 16 years. Because the church wasn't just wood and sermons. It was order. And order had demanded sacrifice. Philip stared at the candle flame, unable to escape the thought. What is a holy place, if it's built on blood? A sudden knock broke his thoughts. When he opened the door, Ezekiel stood in the moonlight. Gaunt, gray, but composed. "They're not well," he said simply. "The dreams are coming faster now." Phillips followed him across the gravel path to the small cabin where the Morrisons were staying. Inside, both girls sat upright as if they hadn't slept, their eyes glassy. Rachel whispered to herself, while Rebecca stared blankly at the wall. "They talked to us again," Rebecca murmured, not even looking at the men. "Hope and faith." Phillips took a cautious step forward. "What did they say?" Rachel turned, voice so soft, it felt like a thread ready to snap. "They said it's not over. Not until someone speaks their names out loud in the church. Not until the truth is told where the lie was preached. They won't rest," Rebecca added, because the town pretended they never existed. It struck Phillips like thunder. The erasure, not just the murder, but the deliberate forgetting. The graveyard had no markers. The church had no mention. The congregation over the years had allowed their memory to rot in silence. "They want a voice," he whispered. "No," Ezekiel corrected him, stepping forward. "They want justice." Outside, the wind howled through the trees like the ghosts themselves had come for reckoning. Phillips knew then what had to be done. Tomorrow, during service, in that cursed church, their names would be spoken aloud. Hope and Faith Wittman. And the town would remember. Sunday morning came with the weight of judgment. The clouds hung low, suffocating the valley. Mist clung to every branch like ash after a fire. Pine Hollow awoke not to birdsong, but to an eerie, unnatural stillness, as if the town itself held its breath. The church bell rang at 9:00 a.m., not by human hands. Several claimed later that no one had been near the rope when it swung, yet its echo rolled through the hills like a warning. Inside the chapel, the congregation gathered with heavy hearts and darker thoughts. Faces that once wore pride now showed cracks of fear and shame. Pastor Phillips stood behind the pulpit, but he didn't open his Bible. He opened Pastor Hayes's journal and began to read. The room was silent as stone. Page by page, sin by sin, he spoke aloud the hidden history of Pine Hollow. The confrontation with Jacob Wittman, the threats, the murder, the lie. He spoke not like a pastor, but like a witness at trial. When he read the final entry, "May God have mercy on my soul," several in the pews began to cry. Not sobbing, silently, like guilt made physical. Then Phillips turned to the altar and did what no one had dared in 16 years. He said their names. Hope Wittman, Faith Wittman. This congregation buried your bodies and your memory, but no longer. We speak you now, not as myth, but as truth. The moment those names crossed his lips, the temperature in the church dropped. Every candle flickered. A low moan, like wind through broken reeds, passed through the room. But it wasn't wind. Every soul in that room heard it clearly. Two voices, young, female, singing, A hymn no one had taught the Morrison twins, but that both girls now mouthed in perfect harmony, eyes closed. The same hymn that had once been sung by the Wittman sisters, according to the old records. The last melody heard in that church before the blood was spilled. People fell to their knees. Some wept. Others whispered prayers they hadn't uttered in decades. Even Samuel Turner, who had shouted madness only days before, sat pale and trembling, clutching a wooden cross as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the earth. When the hymn faded, Rebecca opened her eyes. "They're gone now," she said quietly. "Not gone," Rachel corrected. "Set free." Phillips looked down at the floorboards. He knew what had to come next. This place had to be torn down. Not just the church, but the lie it had stood for. By sundown, the decision had been made. The elders gathered in the church one final time. Pastor Phillips, Ezekiel Morrison, and the heads of Pine Hollow's oldest families. No votes, no discussion. Just a quiet, solemn agreement that echoed through the wooden beams like a funeral bell. The church had to burn, not simply for justice, but because no repentance could be complete while its bones still stood. The structure had been built with stolen blood, sealed with murder, and sanctified by silence. Every board, every nail, every hymn sung inside it had become part of a deception that infected generations. Cleansing required fire. That night, they began dismantling it, board by board, candle by candle, each strike of the hammer like a confession. Pastor Phillips led the work himself, his hands blistered, his voice hoarse from prayer. Ezekiel stood beside him, offering neither comfort nor absolution, only presence. And the twins watched. Rebecca and Rachel sat on the edge of the cemetery hill, their small hands folded, their eyes fixed on the church as if attending a burial. Neither smiled, neither cried. They just watched the flames rise. The fire was lit at midnight. A dozen torches ignited the dry, aged wood like judgment falling from heaven. It wasn't chaos. It was ritual. A funeral pyre for generations of lies. The congregation stood in silence as the chapel cracked and screamed, flames licking upward like a soul clawing to escape its sins. Then the singing began, but it didn't come from the twins. It came from the fire. Voices, high, pure, childlike. Two of them, singing the same hymn from that Sunday morning, a harmony so perfect, so otherworldly, even the crickets ceased. Pastor Phillips fell to his knees. "Forgive us," he whispered into the earth. "God, forgive us." Then came the wind. It howled down from the Cumberland peaks, as if the mountains themselves were exhaling. The flames shifted, and for a brief moment, every soul present would later swear they saw them. Two girls in white, standing inside the fire, Hope and Faith Wittman, smiling, not with vengeance, but with peace. And then they were gone. The church collapsed inward, with a final groan of ash and timber. The ground trembled. Embers flew skyward like spirits ascending, and Pine Hollow was never the same again. Not because justice had been done, but because truth had finally spoken and demanded to be heard. The fire had consumed more than wood. It had devoured the illusion that Pine Hollow was innocent, that its foundations were untainted. In its place stood a wound, open, smoking, holy. The next morning, ash still hung in the air, like snowfall from another realm. And something else had arrived with the dawn. A horseman, tall, clean-shaven, dressed in a long black coat that caught the light like polished obsidian. His horse bore no dust from the trails, no sweat, no wear. as if it had not traveled at all. He didn't speak when he dismounted, didn't tie his reins, just walked directly toward Pastor Phillips, who stood staring at the smoldering ruin with eyes that hadn't closed all night. "I've come about the twins," the stranger said, voice like velvet on a dagger. Phillips blinked. "Who are you?" But the man didn't answer. He produced a letter. Government seal, folded 3 times. The ink hadn't faded despite being dated November 14th, the day before the Morrisons arrived. Inside, it read, "To the clergy of Pine Hollow Baptist Church. We have received reports of anomalous behavior from the children of itinerant preacher Ezekiel Morrison. Their knowledge of sensitive historical events and personal affairs has attracted attention from the Kentucky Scientific Inquiry Board and other interested parties. Do not attempt to relocate them. Observe, record, and await further instruction. Dr. Isaiah Collingwood, Director, Bureau of Human Cognition and Applied Supernatural Studies." Pastor Phillips stared at the signature. He had heard whispers of this bureau, always in tones too quiet for eavesdropping, an agency that existed in no formal record, formed after the Great Awakening to track phenomena the church could not explain. Twins, prophets, unquiet graves, people who dreamed of history and woke up with facts no one could deny. But what chilled him wasn't the letter, it was the date. The letter arrived before the twins did, as if someone already knew they were coming. Ezekiel Morrison stood quietly behind him, his hand resting on Rachel's shoulder. "I've seen him before," he said, nodding toward the stranger. "Where?" "In a dream," Ezekiel whispered. Rebecca looked up at the man. Her eyes narrowed. "You were there when Mama died," she said softly. The man smiled, but not kindly. "Your mother," he replied, "was one of ours, until she learned too much." And just like that, the fire they thought had ended something was only the beginning. The horseman's words hung in the chilly morning air, like a curse. Ezekiel's jaw tightened as memories flooded back, visions of his late wife, Sarah, shrouded in shadow and silence. He never spoke much about her, but now her past clawed its way into the present with terrifying clarity. The stranger's presence was no accident. It was a summons, a reckoning from forces lurking just beyond the veil of ordinary life. An unseen apparatus that controlled more than anyone dared to admit. "I am Dr. Collingwood," the man declared, his voice steady, a cold authority beneath the surface. "You and your daughters are part of an experiment begun decades ago, a test of the human mind's capacity to access knowledge beyond time and space. The Bureau exists to study these phenomena, but also to contain them." Ezekiel's eyes narrowed. "Contain or control?" The doctor's gaze didn't waver. "Both. Gifts like those your daughters possess come with costs, not just for them, but for the world." Rebecca and Rachel exchanged a glance, a silent understanding between souls who carried burdens too heavy for children. They had glimpsed shadows no adult had dared to face, secrets buried beneath generations of lies. Collingwood turned to Pastor Phillips. "You have been a keeper of secrets far longer than you realize. Your church, this community, it is a microcosm of a greater struggle. The line between salvation and damnation is thinner than you think." Phillips swallowed hard, feeling the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes pressing down. The stories whispered behind closed doors, the cryptic glances, the unexplained phenomena. None of it was coincidence. "They fear what your daughters can reveal," Collingwood continued. not just to this congregation, but to the world beyond. They will come for you all, if you let them. Ezekiel stepped forward, voice low and resolute. We do not fear. The truth cannot be buried forever. The doctor's expression flickered. A momentary flash of respect. Courage is commendable, but the path ahead is dark, filled with enemies both visible and hidden. As he mounted his horse and vanished into the swirling mist, the Morrison family and the small congregation stood trembling, caught between ancient corruption and the fragile hope that some truths, no matter how dangerous, must be unearthed. If you understand the weight of what the Morrison twins carry, the price of forbidden knowledge, comment, I see the unseen twice below. Let it mark your commitment to the path few dare to walk, and awaken the awareness buried deep within. The words, I see the unseen, echoed silently in the still air, a mantra for those ready to confront what lurks beneath the surface of reality. Because the truth about the Morrison twins was only the beginning, a single thread unraveling a tapestry soaked in blood, fear, and deception. In the days following Dr. Collingwood's warning, Pine Hollow shifted. The once close-knit community fractured, suspicion like poison creeping through every handshake, every glance. Doors that had always remained open now creaked shut, and whispers of dark forces began to ripple through the hills. Ezekiel knew the fragile peace was broken, yet he refused to abandon the girls. His faith, battered but unyielding, was his armor. He understood that the twins were not just vessels of revelation. They were lightning rods for the storm gathering in the shadows. Rebecca and Rachel, despite their youth, became unwitting warriors caught in a battle older than the mountains surrounding them. Their dreams grew darker, more vivid, revealing a hidden network of influence that stretched far beyond Pine Hollow, an invisible hierarchy, controlling information, manipulating belief, and silencing those who dared uncover forbidden truths. Each night, the twins whispered fragmented visions to their father, faces cloaked in shadow, symbols carved into ancient wood, cryptic messages buried in forgotten tomes. The past and future blurred as the girls described events with a chilling clarity. Wars fought in silence, alliances forged in blood, betrayals masked by sanctity. Pastor Phillips, too, felt the crushing weight of revelation. He revisited the hidden corners of the church, searching for clues within the creaking timbers and faded records. There he found the remnants of a secret so entrenched that even the stones seemed to murmur warnings. It was then he realized the church wasn't just a house of worship. It was a fortress guarding sins too monstrous for daylight. Beneath its foundation lay secrets entwined with power, corruption, and a pact sealed long before the first hymn was sung. And the Morrison twins. They were the reckoning, the key to unlocking what generations had desperately tried to conceal. As shadows lengthened and the night deepened, Ezekiel understood. This was no mere spiritual trial. This was a war for the soul of Pine Hollow, and possibly something far greater. The question now wasn't if they would survive, but whether they would live to tell the story. The night air hung thick with unease, the kind that seeps into bones and refuses to leave. Ezekiel sat by the dying embers of the fire, clutching the worn leather satchel that contained his Bible and the fragments of a shattered faith. His daughters, restless and pale, retreated to a quiet corner, their eyes reflecting the weight of knowledge no child should bear. Pine Hollow was no longer a simple mountain village. It had become a crucible, a place where hidden forces clashed beneath the veneer of rustic piety. The twins' dreams had begun to bleed into reality, disturbing images, prophetic warnings that grew sharper, more urgent, with each passing night. Rebecca's voice broke the silence, a fragile thread in the darkness. "Father, the past is not dead. It lives in the shadows of these hills. The ones who built the church did so, with hands stained in blood. But their legacy is far from over." Rachel nodded, clutching her sister's hand. "We see them watching, waiting. The same eyes that hid the truth now seek to bury it forever." The words struck Ezekiel like a hammer. He remembered the subtle glances, the hushed conversations abruptly silenced when the twins entered a room. Pine Hollow was suffocating under a web of lies, lies woven so tightly that the very ground seemed complicit in the deception. His mind flashed back to Pastor Hayes's journal, the cryptic final entry, "The Lord forgive us all," scrawled in trembling ink. The secrets weren't just sins of omission. They were active, corrosive forces that shaped the community's every breath. But what disturbed Ezekiel most was the realization that the Morrison twins were not mere witnesses. They were catalysts. Their revelations peeled back the layers of carefully constructed facades, exposing raw wounds festering beneath. He glanced at the girls, their faces etched with exhaustion, eyes burning with a fierce determination. The twins carried a burden far heavier than any child should bear, the weight of truth that could shatter lives and topple legacies. And yet, in their fragile frames, there was an unspoken defiance. They were the reckoning that Pine Hollow had long avoided. The question looming over Ezekiel was no longer about faith or fate. It was about survival. How to protect his daughters, how to face the darkness closing in from every side, and how to confront the sinister forces desperate to silence them. Because once the truth begins to surface, there is no turning back. The next morning dawned cold and gray, a thick fog rolling in from the hollows, like a living thing swallowing the sun. Ezekiel's mind churned as he prepared to leave Pine Hollow. But the village already felt transformed, a place forever marked by the Morrison twins' haunting revelations. As the family gathered their few belongings, a distant sound broke the morning stillness. Hoofbeats echoed sharply against the packed dirt road winding through the trees. A lone rider appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the mist like a ghost emerging from the past. The man was older, his face weathered but stern, dressed in worn leather and dark cloth that spoke of authority and secrets. He carried no visible weapons, yet there was a palpable tension in his gait, as if he was more than just a traveler. When he dismounted before the church, the congregation stiffened. Pastor Phillips stepped forward, his expression wary but curious. "I am Jeremiah Caldwell," the rider announced, voice low and steady. "A man sent to reclaim what was lost and ensure that Pine Hollow's sins are paid in full." The words chilled the gathered crowd. Whispers spread like wildfire. Who was this man, and what debt did he speak of? Jeremiah's eyes locked onto the Morrison twins with an unsettling intensity. "I know what you see, the shadows that cling to this place, the blood that stains the soil beneath your feet." Rebecca's blue eyes narrowed, meeting his gaze without flinching. "And who sent you to Pine Hollow?" "A brother bound by blood and vengeance," he said, stepping closer. "The sins of our forefathers are not forgotten. The debts they owe will be collected." The twins exchanged a glance, an unspoken warning passing between them. Ezekiel instinctively stepped protectively toward his daughters. This was no ordinary visitor. Jeremiah's presence confirmed what Ezekiel had feared. The secrets beat sand. Unhear had not only corrupted the past, they were alive, active and hungry. The church's foundation trembled beneath the weight of unspoken horrors, and with every breath, the line between past and present blurred. What began as a story of innocent children gifted with impossible knowledge was now a deadly game, with stakes far higher than anyone in Pine Hollow could comprehend. Ezekiel knew that from this moment forward, nothing would be the same. The twins' journey into darkness was accelerating, and the sinister forces drawn to their truth were closing in like wolves. He braced himself for the coming storm, a reckoning centuries in the making, where faith, fear, and fury would collide in a battle for the souls of the lost. Jeremiah Caldwell's arrival was more than a disruption. It was a summons to confront the darkest corners of Pine Hollow's history. As he paced the church's creaking floorboards, his voice took on a grave urgency. You think the past is dead, buried with the bodies beneath these walls? You are wrong. The truth is a living thing. It hunts, it waits, and it demands justice. The congregation, once steeped in denial, now trembled under the weight of his words. Jeremiah's presence was a reckoning, an embodiment of retribution for sins long ignored. He claimed to represent a hidden order, one that had been quietly watching Pine Hollow for decades, ensuring that secrets remained buried, but also prepared to punish those who dared to uncover them. The twins listened silently, their youthful faces masks of solemnity. Rebecca spoke softly. The dreams grow darker. They tell us not just what happened, but what is coming. Rachel nodded, her eyes reflecting a storm of knowledge far beyond her years. We see shadows moving closer, voices whispering warnings. Jeremiah's gaze shifted toward Ezekiel. Your daughters carry a burden no child should bear, but their gift is also a weapon. Use it wisely, or it will destroy you all. This cryptic warning left Ezekiel unsettled. The idea that his daughter's extraordinary insight was both a blessing and a curse weighed heavily on him. The fine line between salvation and destruction was thinner than ever. Jeremiah then revealed chilling details. The church's blood-soaked foundations were linked to a series of disappearances and unnatural deaths throughout the region. Disappearances dismissed by history as accidents or wilderness tragedies. But these were orchestrated acts, sacrifices meant to protect the secret power hidden beneath the church. This is not just a story of ghosts or curses, Jeremiah declared. It's a story of power. Ra, who ancient power wielded by men who believed themselves above the law of God or man. He handed Ezekiel a worn, cryptic manuscript, its pages filled with coded passages and ominous symbols. This holds the key, but be warned, knowledge comes at a cost. As Jeremiah prepared to leave, he paused and turned back. When the truth is revealed, it will change everything you think you know about Pine Hollow and about the world beyond these hills. The air grew heavy with anticipation, and a deep unease settled over the gathering. The twins clung to Ezekiel, their eyes reflecting the storm inside. Now I want you to take a moment, and if you're watching this, comment, I walk through shadows twice, down below. Say it twice. This is not just a phrase. It's your passage into understanding the deeper mysteries we're about to expose. By claiming this phrase, you lock in your place as a seeker, ready to step further into the abyss, beyond the veil that hides forbidden knowledge. Because what comes next is not for the faint of heart. It is dangerous, dark, and it will change you forever. The night after Jeremiah Caldwell's visit, the church seemed to breathe with a life of its own. Shadows stretched long and thin along the creaking floorboards. Ezekiel sat alone in the dim glow of a candle, the cryptic manuscript open before him. Its pages whispered secrets older than the mountains themselves, written in a language half forgotten, but still pulsing with sinister energy. As his fingers traced the faded ink, a sudden chill slithered through the room. The twins' voices echoed softly in his memory, visions not bound by time, bleeding from past to present. They had spoken of shadows growing closer, voices warning in the dark. Ezekiel understood now that their gift was no mere divine blessing, but a curse that tethered them to a hidden war waged beneath the surface of their small, forgotten town. The manuscript revealed fragments of an ancient pact, an unholy alliance forged in blood between the founders of Pine Hollow and a nameless power lurking beneath the earth. A covenant sealed with the lives of the innocent, binding the community to a cycle of silence and sacrifice. Every whispered rumor of missing travelers, every unexplained death, was a thread woven into this dark tapestry. Ezekiel's heart pounded with a terrifying clarity. Pine Hollow was no sanctuary. It was a prison built on bones. Suddenly, footsteps approached. The twins appeared in the doorway, their small faces pale but resolute. Rebecca held out a scrap of paper, another piece of their mysterious puzzle. "We saw this in a dream," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "It's a name, a place. It's where the darkness begins." Rachel nodded, eyes burning with a fierce determination that belied her years. "We must go there. It's the only way to break the curse." Ezekiel hesitated. The road ahead was shrouded in uncertainty and danger, but the weight of their secret demanded action. To ignore it was to allow the shadows to consume them all. Outside, the wind howled through the ancient trees like a mournful cry, as if the mountains themselves warned of the path Ezekiel and his daughters were about to take. This journey would lead them deeper into a forgotten history of power and corruption, beyond any truth Pine Hollow had dared to confront. And for those watching now, remember, commenting, "I walk through shadows twice," is not just participation. It's a commitment to the truth, a declaration that you are ready to face what lies hidden, no matter how dark. Because once you step further down this path, there is no turning back. The morning broke over Pine Hollow with a hollow silence, as if the land itself held its breath. Ezekiel, Rebecca, and Rachel prepared for the journey that would unravel everything they thought they knew, everything the town had buried beneath years of lies and fear. Their destination was a forgotten cavern, deep in the Cumberland foothills, spoken of only in fearful whispers among the oldest settlers, a place the twins called the Hollow of Whispered Blood. According to the manuscript and their dreams, this cavern was the origin of the ancient curse, the wellspring of the darkness that had poisoned Pine Hollow since its founding. As they walked, Ezekiel's mind raced with questions. What awaited them inside? Could the truth be so monstrous that it shattered faith itself? What price would they pay for unveiling it? The path wound through dense thickets and jagged rocks, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. The twins walked ahead, their eyes scanning shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, as if unseen forces watched their every move. At the cavern's mouth, a sinister stillness swallowed them whole. Inside, the walls pulsed with an unearthly glow, etched with symbols older than Christianity, symbols that told of a pact forged in blood and fear between men, desperate for power, and an entity beyond human comprehension. The twins' voices rose, chanting words from their dreams, a prayer, a warning, a summons. As they spoke, the ground trembled, and a cold wind howled through the cavern, carrying voices from the past. Cries of the Wittman sisters, whispers of stolen souls, confessions of guilt etched into stone. Ezekiel felt his resolve falter, but the twins' hands gripped his, grounding him in a terrifying clarity. This was no longer just their story. It was the story of every secret sacrifice, every hidden atrocity that had stained the land, and it corrupted the very foundation of their faith. In that dark hollow, the truth burned through the shadows, raw, relentless, and merciless. Pine Hollow was never innocent. It was a crucible of power forged on blood and silence. The twins' curse was not just knowledge. It was the burden of memory, the living conscience of a town that refused to face its sins. As they emerged into the first light of dawn, Ezekiel knew the world they returned to would never be the same, and neither would those who dared to learn the truth. If you've made it this far, you've stepped beyond the veil. Now, say it with me one last time. I walk through shadows, twice. Because real knowledge demands courage. Real awakening demands sacrifice. Real power comes to those willing to confront the darkness, not run from it. This is your initiation. Welcome to the deeper truth.